That's going to be exciting. So, all semester we've talked about different perceptual capabilities, right? And how those relate to your...
Did you press the record button?
I did, as a matter of fact. Yeah. How those relate to your sort of the underlying sensory capabilities, right? But what we're going to talk about today is how those things are different between folks, right? How many of you have better or worse vision or hearing or touch or taste or smell than somebody else? Like everybody, right? Because nobody is identical, right? Everybody's capabilities are slightly different. Some of those things vary systematically, right? And we can sort of put people into groups and say people in this group perform better or worse on a certain kind of task than people in this group, and here are the underlying biological reasons why that might happen, right? And then sometimes it's like, well, we have no idea why that person's better or worse at a particular sensory task, but it's kind of fun to think about anyway. Does that work? And so we'll talk about a lot of cool stuff. So there are four sort of major sources, potential major sources of individual differences: age, sex, culture, and expertise. Right? And that's kind of it, right? I mean, those are like the big differences in everybody, right? So if we're going to say, hey, like, what are the like, you know, list 3 or 4 things that are big, broad categories that are differences in folks. These are the things that you might come up with, right? So let's talk about age first, right? Age happens, right? Might as well get ready for it. So what about changes in vision when we talk about age, right? Most of you are going to say, if I just ask you, say like, oh, your vision gets worse when you get older. And that is true, right? But what's really interesting is it doesn't get that much worse as you get older compared to how much better it is now than when you were like less than a year old, right? So Eli, I think this is pretty awesome. There's a massive improvement in your visual acuity during those first 5 years of life, right? Babies, oh man, not only are they just going to wail around and scream and slobber and other such things, they can't even see. Of course, I can imagine if I was a baby and I couldn't see what was going on, I might, like, you know, flail around and scream as well, right? And so maybe I give them a little bit of a pass on that. So there's this massive increase in vision and capability in the first 5 years. Then, from about your mid-20s on, there's a slight sort of decrease in visual acuity. When you hit your mid-40s, it speeds up just a little bit, and then you get another little uptick in your mid-70s, right? But again, when we're talking about, you know, if you're measuring this, this is about 1, and this is somewhere, you know, around 2. So you're changing your visual acuity in sort of 1 minute of arc space, right? Which is not that big. Whereas in those first 5 years, you're going from somewhere around, you know, 75 down to that 1, right? That's a massive change. So there's this massive rapid change in the first 5 years, and then sort of a steady, slow decrease in visual acuity as you get older. So that's something to look forward to, right?
My eyesight started out real bad when I was young, like probably younger than that. So.
Good luck.
I know. Thank
Yeah.
God for glasses and contacts.
Wear them both at the same time.
Ugh.
So what may happen to you, and I know you're not going to want to hear this, you might actually develop a second visual problem as you get older. So that does happen to some folks, right? So you can actually end up with 2 things. That's why you need like the bifocals and the trifocals and the quadfocals, right? Because you have different sort of visual capabilities later.
Hey, you were joking about quadfocals, right? Is that a thing?
Yeah, I'm not joking about it.
That's a thing?
Yeah.
Jeez.
Depending on your problem. And now what they have are these sort of like, they're sort of gradual changes, so they're not even really like any kind of, like, they're just like infofocals. I don't know, right? I'm just going to make that up. So it'll gradually change.
Progressive.
Yeah, right. So you're not really having these kind of clear cut. Like if you looked at like old bifocals, there was like a clear line, right? And you know, like maybe your grandparents wore those or something. You're like, oh, there's that big line. That's where you went from like one prescription to another, but now they're progressive. So it's kind of like this gradual change.
My grandpa still has those.
They're the best.
Still wears it.
Yeah, why not, right? I mean, they still work.
Sure.
So what causes some of these changes, right? This is kind of interesting. So why early on do we have these improvements? Okay, a lot of this is due to changes in the retina. Okay, one, we pack those cones more tightly over time in the fovea, right? So as we age, we're increasing the density of cones in the fovea. As we increase the density of those photoreceptors, then we can improve our visual acuity, right? Because we have more cones packed in that same amount of space, so our cycles per degree and that Nyquist limit changes, right? So that's pretty cool. Also,
Remind me, what are foveal cones again?
so all of your cones are in the center part of your vision, right? These are the photoreceptors that you use to see color,
Right.
and the ones that you use when you're like trying to read something, right? So that's why you don't read holding a piece of paper out here. You hold it right in the middle, so you put it on the center of vision.
So what's happening to the retina when there are early improvements? Is it like?
You're actually adding and packing in more cones in the fovea.
So foveal cones are for, like, essentially for reading, like, they're
Well,
sort
you're-
of for recognizing, like, language, so to speak, and, like, they're apparently all around the eye, but they're more densely packed in the center, would you say?
So no, I wouldn't say either of those. The fovea is the only place you will have cones, right? You're not going to have cones in the
Okay.
periphery. Secondly, your cones are used for any sort of vision that you're doing during the day because they require high levels of light. Okay, so they're going to have high levels of light. They're going to handle color vision. Anything that you need to really see that's a high spatial acuity, you're going to have to look at a lot of detail. That's going to be handled by your cones.
Okay,
So
so
not just-
foveal cones are more for day
Yes.
view sight. Okay.
Now we're on the right page. So on top of
Prepare for me to ask a lot more stupid questions like that.
because it's fine. So on top, Chloe, of adding more cones to the fovea, the cones we do have are going to get longer. That outer segment of the cone is the part of the cone that catches photons of light, right? So essentially we're making our light net, you know, the net we're using to catch light, we're making that bigger. So guess what we're doing? We're catching more light, we're able to see things better, right? Because we're catching more photons, because that outer segment is actually getting bigger. So that's pretty cool, right? On top of that, we've got one more thing going on. Your eye gets bigger, right? And before we talked about, who remembers the intrareceptor angle? Yeah, that was kind of, right, Olivia? That was a fun thing. And we said the biggest eye possible is the best eye, because then we can put so many photoreceptors in there that each one is responsible for only a small piece of the world, right? And they're responsible for smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller pieces of the world as your eye gets bigger and bigger and bigger, right? And we said there was some limit to how big your eyes can get because of how big your head is, because of how big your mom's hips are, right? And so there's some limiting factors there. But the bigger our eyes are, the better. And as we get older, our eyes get bigger, so we have more photoreceptors crammed in there, right? Is that cool? That's awesome. What about things, so that's the big early improvements. Now as you get older, there are things that happen. You lose pupil mobility. Okay, this shouldn't be a surprise if anybody has seen someone get older. You lose mobility everywhere, right? So it's not a real surprise that your pupil doesn't adjust as much, right? And we know pupil adjust to light levels, right? So that we can have the optimum amount of light coming in so we can detect and discriminate what we're seeing. Your lens will get cloudy and it will get stiff. How many of you know someone who's had cataracts? Okay. Yeah, right? Guess when that happens? More often when you're older, right? This happens.
It causes the cloudiness of the lens, like what is the cloudiness, so to speak? Because I've physically viewed it, not in humans. I had a dog who went blind very early on.
Yeah, yeah.
So he always had that basically a literal cloud in his eye, and it was just there. It didn't move, it didn't change shape or anything. It was just physically there. What causes that?
So who loves cataracts, right?
And what is it on?
Yeah, so the cataract's in your lens, right? I mean, it's like a cloudy lens.
Because it always looked like it was on with that picture completely, it always looked like it was on the inside of the cornea, or at least that's how it looked.
Yeah, it is. So what happens, so you have your lens here, right?
Mhm.
And over time, the proteins that are in your lens, they clump up together.
Okay.
And instead of like letting the light go through, the light gets jammed up and then it gets fuzzy.
Okay, so that's sort of what causes that weird white
Yeah,
blob.
I was hoping that was a good picture. I mean, that's a decent picture there.
I mean, that, yeah, the one right next to that is pretty accurate to what I saw in my dog.
Yeah, it's just like a conglomeration of the proteins in your
Okay.
lens.
Okay.
And they just get oriented in a way that blocks the light instead of a way that lets the light pass through. And that just happens over time.
So at that point, the light is bouncing off instead of going through.
Well, some of it's
going through, but most of it is bouncing off, leaving that white color.
Yep.
So are you really just saying like shadows and movement rather than like detailed images?
Yeah, so, I mean, this is a pretty good picture. You're gonna see like blotches of color, nothing's gonna be defined. Because who remembers the point spread or the line spread function that we talked about, right? And we said, when light comes in, if it gets scattered, then it makes a fuzzy image, right?
Yeah.
But if it comes in and it stays where it belongs, then it's gonna be a
It's
sharp
sharp.
image. Any light that gets through here, Alex,
It's gonna be scattered and fuzzy.
exactly, right?
Okay.
Because it's hitting all those proteins.
So they can basically still see, they just can't, like, not nearly as well as they are normally able to.
Yeah.
All right, does that make sense?
So does that mean that everybody that like can't see well has cataracts then?
No.
Because like I have contacts, and if I take them out, that's what the picture looks like.
Right, so there are tons of other reasons why, right? So you might be nearsighted or farsighted, is gonna be my guess, is what the problem is. That's an issue with the size of your eye in relation to the ability of your lens to bend light and focus it on the right.
So how do you tell the difference?
Well, you can kind of look at somebody's eye, and if it looks like this, you know it's a cataract.
Okay.
So there's that. The other thing is if you're nearsighted or farsighted, you can see things either close or far away.
One or the other.
Yeah, one or the other. If you have cataracts, everything's going to be fuzzy no matter where it is.
Okay.
Can they be removed?
Oh, yeah. No, there's cataract surgery.
Let's watch the cataract surgery.
Let's watch cataract surgery.
Yes.
Yeah, some people are
There
already
images of cataracts.
Is it the same as, like,
diagram
when-
images?
It's kind of
beyond
like when
the
they
image
correct
section,
your
so-
eyes, like
Right.
LASIK surgery.
the same
kinda
thing
like
as
they just
LASIK
like
surgery?
shave it off your eye.
So what they'll do is and they'll just replace your lens.
It's essentially
I was gonna say,
build
because
up.
they can't really shave it, because it's taking out
It's
your
awesome because they
lens, so
stick
that's,
like
Yeah.
a knife
The-
underneath your
they just
eyeball.
replace the lens.
The
Yeah.
shaving is on the cornea. So you guys are thinking about like
Astigmatism?
the name just left me. The kind of surgery.
LASIK.
LASIK.
LASIK, yeah. I knew there was like some, the other name I was thinking was like keratotomy, but that's because they're like chopping off the keratin of your cornea. And that was the technical name, but LASIK's what you know. That's
So, like,
different.
Where are they getting the lens from?
Oh, it's fake.
It's fake, okay.
Yeah, it's a
Okay,
fake
I was
lens. They'll stick
gonna
fake lens.
say. They just, like, organ
friend.
donations?
You just have, yeah, you have to get a friend.
well,
Right.
Can they be donated? Can eyes actually be transplanted?
Corneas can.
Not the whole eye
Okay.
as of yet, but corneas, yeah.
As of yet.
Well, I mean, you know, if you'd asked me in 1700, can hearts be transplanted? No, not yet.
Well, I know, I'm just saying, it's just,
They can. Will it work? Probably not.
But I think eventually eyes, more things will be able, you know, we'll get plug and play stuff.
hands.
I never knew if we were at that level of technology to just wholly replace one person's eye with another.
No, but the corneas we can replace. Yeah, so if you guys die and you don't need your corneas, give them to somebody.
Or use the
Or you can
items
sell
get
it.
in place, they'll get taken.
I donate when you sell.
Because that's illegal.
Because
That
you're,
involves
Yes,
a
but
black
they're
market.
YOLO.
I think they're the highest
And selling-
priced item on the block.
Abby, what do these people do with their lives?
Chemo treatment is legal?
But
So-
think about how many illicit drugs don't get caught. I mean, you know, look at it that way.
Boom.
What's your chance of getting caught?
Of selling my
On the black
lens?
market. Yeah.
Slim enough.
Pretty high if you can't see without it.
I mean, I was saying a lot of drugs
Probably
don't
be
get
doing a
caught,
lot of
so
stuff
I'm just
that's
saying you have a pretty good chance.
noticeable.
You know what the great part about all this is? Huntington is a hub for
There you go. You're in the best.
I don't have to
place
go
do
that
it.
far.
Yeah. Just walk down the street.
So,
The smaller changes in old age reflect.
yeah, so other things, right, like deterioration of your retina. So you have, how many of you have heard of macular degeneration, right?
Totally.
Yeah, that's when you start losing tones in your fovea, and you're like, oh, I can't see anymore. It's the reverse process of this guy where we were increasing that density.
So do they just like sort of die out?
Yeah,
Like,
they
is
just
are they still just there, they just don't work anymore? Or,
They die, and eventually I think the cellular debris gets removed.
okay.
Yeah, they just die.
Okay.
This is worse in anybody, you don't have to answer this, anybody diabetic.
My aunt is diabetic. She's had cataracts
Yeah,
like 3 times.
they gotta check her eyes all the time,
Yeah.
right? So they
And
have.
she's 30.
Yeah, and there are additional problems because of blood flow in the eye to the health of the retina, right? Because those little itty bitty teeny tiny blood vessels can become serious problems if you're diabetic and you don't have the nutrients going in to your cones. It rods it goes in.
Is there a difference between type 1 and type 2?
I'm not certain. I was just going to try to avoid diabetes altogether. That was my plan,
Gotcha.
and not have to worry about it.
Well, I just say like one type is kind of
Yeah.
brought on, so I don't know if maybe that, or if you're just born with it.
I would imagine one, you might have problems earlier than the other if you've been dealing with it longer. But eventually, no problems. And then here's sort of like a broad statement. There are some changes that come from changes in brain function. As you get older, your brain doesn't work as well. So there's something to look forward to. So there's some loss in brain function. And as we know, there's a number of brain regions that are involved in vision, and if those aren't working as well, then you can have some vision problems that are not related to the retina. Now, most of these are related either to the retina or the eyeball itself, right? Your ability to kind of move the lens, whether or not the lens is clouded, things like that, right? Does that make sense? The other thing it doesn't really mention here is like accidents, right? The older you are, the more likely you've had an accident that's injured your eye, just because you've lived longer and, you know, there's a chance that things have happened to you, right? Hey, what about hearing? Hey, what about hearing?
What?
Great job, Alex.
Sorry, I can't hear you over my.
That's why it's the only reason I've left you in this class. You're gonna write that.
Looking at my grade, it's gotta be.
So, when you're younger, there is a slight increase in your hearing, right? As you get older, there's actually a pretty dramatic decline in deterioration in your hearing. This is sort of the reverse, right, of what we saw with vision, where there was a massive increase in visual capabilities and then a gradual loss. With hearing, there's a gradual increase and then a drastic loss, right? A lot of this is due to the decreased efficiency in conduction. What does that mean? Stuff gets jammed up in your ear, right? And the pieces in your ear that vibrate don't vibrate as well, right? Remember those bones, remember a lot of the stuff that was going on in there, and you lose hair cells, okay? Reed, this is one of those things where I said, like, hey, you don't need to know anything from the beginning, but you do kind of have to remember what a hair cell is, right? This is the main guy that's handling like auditory transduction. So those die just like through a regular process, right? Just like we had with macular degeneration. Additionally, with hearing, there's an interesting loss much faster in higher frequencies than there are lower frequencies. And the reason for that is if you remember the structure of the cochlea, we said the part of the cochlea that is has cells for high frequency, Tabby, we said that was kind of stiff and brittle, right? And so that's going to break and die and be damaged more rapidly than the lower frequency.
Does cauliflower ear affect this?
So cauliflower ear is...
Or is that just like, just the outside?
It's going to affect your hearing because remember we said the pinna itself is
Right.
helpful in that process, right? So if you have cauliflower ear, things are going to sound weird for a while until your sort of auditory cortex adapts to that and you're used to hearing things differently. It will also change the attenuation of certain frequencies because the pin is not shaped in a way anymore to make that happen. that's not necessarily, again, that's gonna be like an accident kind of thing. It's not necessarily gonna be as correlated with age. Although it's, everybody familiar with cauliflower ear? Or who's gonna ask about that?
We already have asked about it before.
I thought you did. So I'm proud that you remembered something.
Got something out of this class.
When it comes to the things getting stuck in your ear, can you elaborate on that?
Things getting stuck in your, oh.
Does it consist mostly of wax, or is there is there any other kind of buildup that happens?
So the decreased efficiency of conduction, right? That's what you're asking about.
Yeah.
So there are like moving parts in your ear, right? We're aware of that. You do lose some mobility over time in that, the tympanic membrane will stiffen over time, right? It'll get kind of thicker. There can be wax buildup. That's something that can usually be corrected. But just with age, that tympanic membrane, for example, is going to get stiffer. Just, like most parts of your body as you get age. Not going to.
I thought you did like Legos when you said things. And
Well, I mean, that's obviously something. If you can get Legos stuck in your ear. I mean, that's a thing that can happen.
More often than not, it's stuck in your feet.
They get stuck in your feet.
Yeah.
Don't underestimate little kids.
Yeah.
Just don't.
Stepping on Legos, right? Especially if you have like high pile carpet and they just hide right in there and then you're like, oh, what was that? Hey, here's another one. There's also changes in brain function.
Wow, where did I get that?
I don't know. And so there you go. There's the graph with the hearing threshold. Look at that, like drastic loss, right? And it's happening to you now. And it probably happened to you guys like over here at the 10-year-old age because of those earbuds.
Yeah, I knew this.
You knew I was going to bring that up
I knew it.
because
I'm surprised you didn't do it earlier.
10 years from now, when I jump out from behind a bush, I'm going to have to really yell, what does CPD mean? Cycles per degree. Because you guys aren't going to be able to hear me.
Joke's on you. Because we're
I'm
all going to be
great at reading lips.
You're great at reading lips. I'm going to jump out with a mask. So there you go. You guys are going to lose your hearing.
Well, jokes
So
on
is
you,
there any way
I'm
to
having
reverse it,
hearing
or
aids
is there
for
just no hope?
Or I mean, 10 years from
So
now,
we
they
might
can
as well
come
just
out with
keep using
glasses
them
that
then.
have subtitles.
Glasses with subtitles. Wow, that's an idea. That'd be pretty cool. Yeah. Think about how much easier it'll be to text and drive.
Priorities.
You're going to have a self-driving car anyway.
I think some of those already exist.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Tesla. But it'll become the norm, not
Yeah.
like if you're.
How many of you have a self-driving car right now?
I drive myself.
Yeah, I have one. It's above my feet.
Doesn't really work that way, but okay.
There's a webcomic that addressed one major problem with self-driving cars. A guy leaves his self-driving car open so one guy grabs a rock that weighs approximately the weight of a human, puts it in there and tells it to go to Ottawa, Canada or
This was
something.
staged.
I'm sure there's gonna be like facial recognition.
It was a comic,
So,
not
like,
a
okay,
real
okay.
person. But
All right.
That's
probably might be able to happen.
Pheromone recognition.
What?
That's assuming we're alive.
Pheromone recognition in
Right.
cars.
Yes.
So what about smell and touch? They both actually
Pretty
show
okay.
a little bit of improvement early and then some decline later. Probably again because you're losing cells in those particular systems, right? Secondly, hey, here's something. How many of you use lotion or other skin products? You don't have to raise your hand, but you did.
It's lotion, like
It's-
what?
it's lotion, right? Why do you use lotion?
Scandalous. My skin gets dry.
Yeah, and so that your skin looks younger, right? So you got to start now. So like when you're older, you don't, not like.
So are you saying lotion is good or bad? For later on? Like, are you saying it's like earbuds and that we're screwing ourselves over?
No,
later
no, no.
on?
I think you need to. I mean, you should probably use lotion. I think that's helpful.
Okay.
The oils make you wrinkle faster. You have to get oil free.
Unless you get anti-aging, I have to hold it.
Yeah.
Hold it.
I don't know.
I'll use lotion, sorry, nothing.
What's that
anyone
stuff that's like
says.
paste? My wife uses that.
I think it's blue.
Like
It's like-
body butter?
It's like in a canister, and it's like,
Yeah, it's body butter.
really?
Yeah.
It's nice too.
Is that different?
Yeah,
I
this
So
is-
think
use
you're-
body butter when you want to cook an omelet on.
I don't know.
You know what
And
he's
she's like, here, use some of this stuff on your hands, and I'm like, okay, and then I can't hold on to anything.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that sounds like body butter.
I don't know what it is.
That's my main problem with most lotions, is that
Yeah.
like,
So you're gonna lose some skin elasticity when you get older, and you're gonna lose touch receptors. So that's something to watch out for too. So there you go, there's some nice little graphs, you don't have to look at that. Changes in the brain as you get older. Sort of early on your brain weight increases, right, because your brain's growing and expanding, and then it starts to gradually decline as you get older. You don't typically lose a whole lot of brain cells. I mean, you are losing some brain cells, but that's not the major loss. The major loss is a deterioration in myelin.
what is that again?
So myelin is what's wrapping your axons that's responsible for allowing you to send signals from one place to another quickly, right? So if you lose that insulation on your axons, then the signals that you try to send don't go as quickly, right?
kind of like circuits. Like circuits themselves in a computer. Or
Absolutely.
Even in electricity, they have an insulation around.
It's like a cord, like
Yeah.
the rubber part of the cord.
And that's what happens in MS.
Absolutely. MS is you are losing the myelination, and so you have difficulty sending signals from one place to the other. That's why folks with MS have a variety of symptoms, right? Some folks will have different symptoms because they have that loss of myelin in different places, right? Often we think of sort of motor difficulties, but there are other difficulties with MS as well because they're just having difficulty getting those signals to go through and go through quickly. Chandler, just a good one.
David Sinclair is.
David Sinclair.
He's a biologist at some university who studies anti-aging. And I don't know, it's not really, it's more of an after-class topic, actually, now that I'm thinking about it.
Okay.
Especially if you don't know who he is.
Okay, we can talk later, no worries. So there are also these studies of selective rearing. We haven't really talked about selective rearing, right? Which is kind of interesting. There was, what do we mean by selective rearing, right? So if you, we don't really do this with people, but it's kind of interesting. If you take an animal or a group of animals and you let them develop in an environment that is lacking a particular visual or a particular sensory stimulus or subclass of stimulus, they will show some deficits in that, in perceiving or sensing that, right? There was a study a number of years ago with kittens where it's not that bad. They raised kittens with, they didn't give them any like vertical lines. They couldn't see any vertical lines, right? So they wore these lenses that prevented them from seeing vertical lines, okay? They could see horizontal lines fine, but it's not vertical. What was interesting is when they grew up a little bit and they took off the lenses, they would constantly like walk into the legs of tables because they couldn't see them, but they could jump up on top of the tables because they could see the horizontal, right? But they just couldn't see the vertical leg as they walked straight into it.
I thought you were going to say something cool like that.
That
is
is cool.
Well,
That is cool, right?
I was expecting like
Yeah.
complete.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a little sad.
So
You
like,
handicapped
could they see
kid-
the corners of walls?
Just to see what would
Huh?
happen.
So they like couldn't see the corners of walls either?
Yeah, so they couldn't see vertical lines at all.
Yeah.
At all.
Yeah,
So what do they
they-
do with the kittens after this? Like,
Let them grow up.
Just throw it away.
I mean,
Like where they
that,
adopted?
I mean,
I-
that just seems like that's just like so debilitating because there's vertical lines everywhere. How?
Yeah, so then they had, that. Well,
You just put the lenses back on.
They literally don't see it.
yeah, so, like in most of these studies, I mean, you really need to take a look at their brains, right? And you have to kind of take the brain out,
Oh.
and that's sort of the end of the story there of the kid.
As of today,
As of today, what?
Yeah.
one day we were able to do heart transplants. Next day we'll be able to do brain transplants.
Yeah, we'll see. But there's also been some work with ferrets doing something similar. And what they found, what's cool with ferrets is their visual cortex develops late in life. And so they were able to do like the, oh, we can't see vertical lines thing. But then later they could like train them to see vertical lines by like showing them luminance gratings. So they could kind of restore that capability.
But they didn't think to do that with kittens. Like, oh.
They probably didn't have a chance to.
But we did, I mean, they didn't know at that time like it would do anything. So they're like, hey, we just need to see what happened. And then somebody was like, well, that's awesome. Let's do it with ferrets, but let's do it this way. And then they took the brains out of the ferrets too. I mean, 'cause kind of have to
They
take a
all
look.
died.
They all die
Delicacy in
eventually.
the Amazons.
What?
Because it's a delicacy in the Amazons.
Ferrets?
Ferret brains.
Really?
Stop.
I think you're making that up.
It's like piece of
They do
head.
eat guinea
What?
pigs in like the Andes.
They're not the type of guinea pigs you get from the
I
pet
know
store.
they're not.
Who eats cow brains?
Reed, you have a real question?
Yeah, it's a real question. Do we need to know anything about the different proteins that are involved with dementia with this?
I don't think so.
Okay, cool.
I don't think so. Possibly on that one.
Yeah.
There's brain weight.
We'll be asking some-
Okay, so we've talked about age. What was next on the list? Let's talk about sex differences, right? Yeah, so here's something that'll cause people to get up in arms. Quick way to start a fight, walk in and say men are, and then whatever, then women at whatever, and you've probably started a conversation that you can't get yourself out of. Happens all the time. So, however, you can imagine, and kind of the next category isn't even, because it's the culture category, right? So things get even a little bit more complicated there. So you can imagine, like, anytime you come out with a statement and you say, this category, I mean, with age, it's not so bad, right? Because we know, like, old people are useless, so everybody's on board with that.
There you go.
Right? Right? And so it's
Well,
not...
great, my friend.
They've only made it to 80. They must not know shit.
Well, they can't tell you about it, I mean, 'cause they've forgotten it. So, but when you start to go like, hey, you know, males are better than females, or people from this culture are better than people from that culture, things get really difficult, right? And so you can also imagine that there are folks who currently and in the past have had some sort of biased agenda on this, right? Like, oh man, I'm a guy, so I'm probably going to want to do an experiment where it makes guys sound really awesome, right? Because we are. And, you know, it's an easy experiment to do. You just like, you know, check box, like who's more awesome, men or women. You just check one, right? And you can figure that out. So you can see, and particularly with culture, things become complicated, right? And there have been like a ton of problems with, you know, sort of sexist issues, right? And there are a lot of other issues. The thing I think to keep in mind here is like, hey, let's just design us a really good experiment, because maybe there are differences across cultures, maybe there are differences across men and women, and if there are, that's interesting, and if there are not, then that's interesting as well. We need to design a good experiment that's fair and balanced for everybody, right? So that when we do that, we can kind of like go, hey, we know something now. The other thing to keep in mind here is to try to, we're going to have to invariably use the word better, right? But better doesn't necessarily mean more valuable or more important, right?
Or that it's the same for everyone.
Yeah, because we're also looking across like large groups and averages, right? And so I think there are some like easy things we could make statements about. So if we were to say like, you know, like here's an easy one I think that most people would agree with, but there are clear exceptions. In general, men are stronger than women, right? I mean, in general, that's a pretty common thing. I mean, it's kind of, there are obviously exceptions in both categories there, but if you were to just take like all men and then all women, and assuming they're like equal numbers of both, then like the men could probably lift more heavy things, right? And that's kind of how it
Well,
goes.
it depends. There are other factors that go into that.
There are a lot of things, right? And so there's a lot going on, and we just have to kind of keep that in mind as we go through and really just try to be careful. The other thing is, if it's really like a sex difference, then we might be able to not just find that in humans, but we might be able to find that in other species, right? So, you know, if you want to try to argue against social factors, right, an easy way to do it is go like, well, is it like that in rats? And if it is, then you can say, well, human culture probably has very little to do with it, right? And so then you can kind of say, well, hey, that's kind of interesting. So let's talk about a few things. Here's kind of, we've already talked about odor identification, right? How many of you remember when we said females tend to be better at odor identification than males, which was kind of cool. We kind of thought about a couple reasons why that might be, right?
They can smell Band-Aid.
Yeah, I know, right? That's important. And hey, if you thought that was exciting, Chandler, because we talked about some evolutionary theories there that might kind of lead to that difference, what was a class you could sign up for where we might talk about something like that again?
Social psychology.
Man, that was so close. That was so close. You almost had it. I know,
Did I
right?
get it wrong?
There has also some evidence to indicate that females are better at the 2-point threshold, so that they have they're slightly more sensitive on that, and so they can tell those two points. You know, they can tell that it's 2 points at a smaller distance than males can, which is kind of interesting as well, right? I don't know why that. I mean, that would be helpful for you if there was like a tick crawling on you, right?
Why?
How many of you like ticks?
Nope, not even a little bit.
Hey, do you know that there's a type of tick that exists in the state of Kentucky called a Lone Star tick that carries an enzyme in its saliva that when it bites you, it delivers that enzyme that can make you allergic to meat, red meat.
Yeah.
And whenever you eat that, you can go to anaphylactic shock and you won't even know that you're allergic to it until you eat meat and die.
Till you give it a try.
It's awesome.
Yep. Ticks are great. They crawl, those little small flat things, they just like crawl up the back of your neck and you can't even really feel them.
Do you own them? Do you own like a farm of them?
A tick farm?
Yeah, like, you seem like you really enjoy them.
Have they done any research with trans people on like this topic in particular? Because it seems like a really cool topic too.
It does, and I don't think so.
There's like 0 studies on trans people.
Yeah.
Man, you just hit it, right?
I think
Because I think that's like, for me, I'm thinking, that's like the coolest thing I ever want to know, right? Because it's like, and we're just now, so I teach physiological psychology, and I've been teaching that for a while. The book that I use, it's been published since like 1970. We just got a chapter in this latest edition that came out like in 2018 about sexual orientation. We just got like, not even a whole chapter, but in the reproductive chapter, we finally got like a column and a half.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh yeah. And then that's like all there is. And I'm like, oh man.
Yeah, I get excited about that, especially like in the intro books.
Yeah.
They're not good.
So, but there are some, I think there are some real reasons why, I mean, there are some legitimate reasons why we don't have a lot of research.
Yeah.
You know, so if you were just like walk up to a group of people and go like, hey, raise your hand if you're trans.
Yes.
I don't know how many hands are going up, right? Even
Yeah.
even hands that should go up. You know that that would answer that in the affirmative. They're like,
Fists might start flying, but
like I don't know, right? I mean, so it's like it's a real.
I don't think
It's a real problem, and I don't know, like if I put up a sign that says like, hey, I'm looking for some trans people, you might just be a little bit apprehensive, like what is this guy really trying to do, right? Is this, I mean, if it's somebody you know, then you're like, oh, okay, yeah, he's just doing something regular, but if it's not somebody you know, then you're like, well, I mean, what are they trying to do? Are they trying to just like, you know, get us out back behind the dumpster and
shoot us and dump us, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, seriously, right?
No, I mean, yeah,
it's
that's
like a real
legitimate
concern.
that I have.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm going to say we know next to nothing.
But how do we get from ticks to trans people?
Because of
It's
the-
related to sex differences in touch performance.
Oh,
So there you go, right? And yeah, no, that was a little bit of an odd segue, I understand, but it's there.
I had the question for like several minutes.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it really is, but we know nearly nothing about it. I have no idea. As much as I would love to, I mean, and you can try to make predictions, but I don't know. There'd be some interesting, you know, maybe you guys can do that. I don't know. You know, in like a few years when society's sort of open to things. Be careful now.
Non-existent. It could be a thesis or a dissertation.
It could be, and there may be people out there doing stuff, but I think it's just so little.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah,
a
just
really
part.
cool study that says their brains line up with the,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's what little we do know. It seems to be, however you identify you know, like, so if you identify as male, you would have a brain that is more similar to a male brain, right? Does that make sense? I mean,
Yeah.
in the language of, it's just kind of tough to say what I'm saying, but I think you guys get it, right? All right. So there you go. I don't know, but whether or not that comes out in any kind of performance difference, I don't know.
Yeah, because I feel like
I don't know,
even
right?
if it lines up, I mean, I feel like you're still limited in some ways to what you can do. Like,
I mean, it's only like so.
So that's like
Yeah,
the other
yeah,
problem,
that's
right?
like-
So there's like maybe
what
some
is what?
like,
Like, how will you socialize?
there's a biological component, but there's a socialization
Yeah.
component as well, right? And so then you have to think about like how are those, and when did someone sort of start identifying? I don't know, right? There's like a
Yeah.
ton of confounds there, and I think that makes the problem even harder to study. And then you're starting to deal with. I mean, it's a subset of the whole population, so the number of folks who are would even qualify for a study like that. I mean, it's like a small number of people, and then trying to recruit them. It's just logistically, it just becomes like a real. Marissa, how hard is it to study someone who only accounts for 10% of the overall population? Huh?
Probably kind of hard.
Yeah, you should know this.
Yeah.
Yeah, right? Right, Laura?
I think we're venturing into almost the 60s on right-handed people and have not broken 20 on the left-handed people.
Yeah, so
it's
like,
doing really well.
we're working on that left-handed study, right? 10% of the people are left-handed. And so we're trying to recruit an equal number of lefties and righties. We gotta work 10 times as hard to get, so it's, there are legitimate methodological concerns and things that you have to do. But if you guys would like to do something like that, I think that would be awesome. I would be really excited to see. So, not like right now, but after class, start on the IRB protocol. I'm out.
Yeah.
So I think that's cool. What about hearing? Females tend to be a little bit better at hearing.
What?
Yeah. Which is kind of interesting. The other one is mental rotation, right? Oh, so maybe I didn't mention this. One of the things that you should be careful of when you find differences, like sex differences or culture differences, you should be careful not to let that create a stereotype either, right? And I think that becomes a problem. And this mental rotation thing is there, right? Like how many people are like, oh, women are horrible drivers because they have no spatial reasoning, right? It's like, anybody heard that one?
Yeah. Oh yeah, all the time.
Yeah, right. And I think most of you are poor drivers because, I mean, not you as in women, but just like you as this whole class probably, because you don't. Again, you're trying to invent a way to text and drive through your glasses. So I'm really concerned.
Because when I watch TV, I like to have subtitles on, and I can't watch TV when my friends don't want subtitles. We have a Game of Thrones party whenever it premieres every Sunday night, and my friends are like, "We're not gonna have on subtitles," and I'm like,
I always have.
"I don't know how to watch
Why
TV
would you?
now."
Okay. Anyway, is mental rotation directly associated with spatial acuity?
Spatial acuity. What do you mean by that?
Well, this is the task is to select the pairs of shape that matches the test shape.
Oh yeah. So you've got a 3D shape, and then there's 5 other shapes that are all in different orientations, and only one of those is actually that shape rotated.
Right. So it's spatial.
Yeah. So you're doing some spatial maneuvering there. What's interesting about that particular line of evidence is it's much more complicated. So it's not even just spatial capabilities in general, it's really just mental rotation. Males tend to do better. But what's really kind of fascinating about this particular thing is that when you test even other species, it seems as though the males of that species tend to be a little better at mental rotation than the females, which is kind of fascinating. So, and then, hey, there are probably some evolutionary psychology theories about why that might be the case, and at least Chandler and Laura are going to learn about those next semester. Yeah, a lot of it's related to sort of hunter-gatherer structure. It is what people hypothesize, right? And so, one member of our species is sort of not just metaphorically, but physically tied to offspring, right? There's that umbilical cord, and then that oh, I've got to feed them thing later for a while, and so
Gotta.
Well, I mean, if you don't want them to die.
Go to Walmart.
Yeah, that Walmart really wasn't a thing out on the savannah, right? And so
Are you sure?
I'm pretty sure about that.
Might have been a hut at that time.
Sam Walton didn't really come around until a few few years ago.
Welcome to Sam's side.
So males, in mammals at least, males are not responsible for like directly feeding offspring. They're sort of secondarily responsible for that, right? They have other things they do. So their mobility is a little bit, they're able to get out away from the home site for longer, whether that's a nest or a hut or whatever it is you have, a burrow. They're able to get away from that, gather resources, and come back, right? And so it might really make a lot of sense for that member of the species to be a little better at some spatial tasks.
Is this whole thing about humans only, or is it like?
Oh yeah, this is all about humans. I mean, this graph is. But other species, this mental rotation difference seems to occur in all mammals that have been tested. Whether that's monkeys, rats, I think they did it in woodchucks. Yeah, I know, right? Isn't that male woodchucks are better at mental rotation than female woodchucks.
I mean, hey, if you got an extra woodchuck.
Yeah, so so it might make sense for one member of the species that's a little bit more tied to the home site, developing their sort of spatial skills or their natural spatial capabilities is not as important. There may be some other things that are important, like being able to smell stuff.
I don't really see how this idea that mental rotation thing could be hypothesized solely on, or primarily on, this idea of hunter-gatherers. A bit absurd because, for one, we were never really doing things that require us to think, if this banana is going to be in this
But we're a
way.
product of that generation.
Huh?
We're a product of that generation. Like there's still.
But I think you also have to mentally rotate your location in space relative to your home site. So as you're like chasing a woolly mammoth or whatever, right? It's probably not just running in a straight line, following the road with the road signs and like this way back to hut. And so you sort of have to keep track of where you were in space around your, right? So then you have to kind of like, well, I got turned around a little bit running this mammoth off of a cliff, which way's back to home. So in general, like, those spatial skills might be more important to males. Now it probably doesn't make a big difference, right? I think like, if males are better at mental rotation, it's like, oh, I can figure out how to get a couch through a door. I don't know that really helps me anymore, right? I don't know that really helps me anymore in life than somebody else. Does that make sense? Because I really think that's what it comes down to. But I guess if you're a woodchuck and you're trying to get a couch through a door,
Yeah.
that might be helpful.
We talked about this.
Sex differences, we talked about that. Controversial. But again, the spatial skill business, mice, voles, rats, monkeys, seems to carry across. All right, what about culture? If I didn't upset you when I talked about men and women, let's see if I can do it talking about culture, right? Let's try one more time. And then we're going to wrap it up with an easy one and say like artists and musicians are awesome.
But they are.
They are, I know. Everybody's going to come back together and that's going to be our common ground, right? Reminds me of, I don't know if you guys know Mark Maron. He's hilarious.
He is.
Yeah, he is. Did you watch Glow by chance?
Yeah.
I nearly died the first episode on some Chipotle because I laughed so hard. I had a piece of chicken get stuck in my throat. One of his lines, which is not repeatable in public, which is many of his lines are not repeatable in public. One in particular just about killed me. And you guys are lucky that the chicken came out or this class wouldn't have happened.
What was the show called again?
Glow.
Glow.
It's based on a true story of this 1990s television show, also called Glow, Glorious Ladies of Wrestling. Unfortunately, it was a real thing. The acting, though, I mean, it's Alison Brie is just phenomenal in that show. I mean, she plays the lead. You guys probably know her from Community and Mad Men.
Oh yeah, totally.
Yeah, he has no idea. But she was great. Emmy nominee, I think, for that. I mean, it was just a phenomenal show. Anyway, he has this bit in one of his shows, and he's talking about people in different political parties and like how at least they both like Tom Petty, but then he's not like sure how much them both liking Tom Petty is going to be enough to maintain their friendship. And so it just made me think about musicians being cool to everybody. And then like only 2 of you know Tom Petty, so
Isn't he like hated now?
he's dead.
Oh, I thought like the general consensus was he was terrible.
Like Tom Petty was terrible? I don't think that's the general consensus, is it? Mary's saying no. No, like Tom Petty's like Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
No, that's Bob Ross. Bob Ross is terrible.
Bob Ross.
That's what we established.
So, culture. So early on they did these things called pictorial competence. They would show you a picture, a nice, horrible 2D picture, and they would say, hey, what's happening here? Right? And they would ask you, like, what's happening? And so if you were to indicate, based on that 2D picture, some 3D story from that, then you were like, okay, well, you did great. So what they would show you basically is you know, and again, this was like how bad things were. Josh, they would show them like a caveman with a spear, throwing it at either an antelope, like a big antelope, or a small, like woolly mammoth thing, right? And the woolly mammoth was closer, but it was like supposed to be in the background, right? And the foreground. And then, so like some people would go, oh, it's trying to stab that woolly mammoth. And you're like, well, no, that's ridiculous. The mammoth is way off in the distance. It's clearly, he's trying to get the antelope, right? And if you said the antelope, then you understood 3D relationships and you were fine, right? So, all right, whatever. What they found is that, and so this was interesting, so it happened in South Africa, is where they did this study. So South Africa in 1960, anybody see any problems yet? I know you guys aren't really like history majors, with like studying differences in culture in South Africa in 1960. Anybody think there might have been like a bias there? Because, yeah, right, some put things together, right? So they basically had 4 groups. They had the schooled and the unschooled group, and then within that they had black and white. And those were kind of like your 4 categories, right? So that's what they would do. And so they would ask these folks like, hey, what do you see? Typically, folks in the unschooled category were like definitely stabbing that woolly mammoth. And people in the schooled category were like, yep, it's going for the antelope, right? I'm like, okay, whatever. And so you think, okay, that's fine. In the breakdown for the black and white, actually, I'm trying to remember the chart. Who has the chart? Who has the book? Yeah, do you see that chart there?
Yeah.
Yeah, what was the schooled white? What was the percentage there?
58.61.
Yeah, the schooled black.
66.22.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting, right? So there's some difference there. Maybe that's significant, maybe it's not. I don't really care. What's really interesting on that is you would imagine if I were to create a good stimulus, right? So this is one of the complaints later. Some folks in Scotland did this story, or did something similar. And they said they gave it to these folks in Scotland, and the same thing happened. About 2/3 of the people in Scotland were like, yeah, I'm going to tell you he's stabbing the antelope. And another third of the people were like, man, he's going for the elephant. If you're creating a stimulus that should be culturally relevant and you're used to looking at that culturally, and you're looking at educated individuals, like 100% of the people should have said, he's going for the antelope, right? And if not, there's like a real problem, right? And so there's like a major problem when 1/3 of the people, even in the schooled category, were like, yeah, I think he's just trying to get that woolly mammoth or elephant, whatever it is. I don't remember what the picture looks like exactly. Is it an elephant or a mammoth?
It's both. So
It's both.
Well, he's okay. Stop. Hold up. So you got the man on the far left.
Yeah.
So he's like over here, and then the woolly mammoth is in the middle, and it's farther back. So the woolly mammoth is smaller on a hill.
Right.
And then just here on the far right is the antelope, which is much bigger, the same size perspective to the man.
Yeah. So
What's that got to do with the
What?
What's that got to do with the nose?
I couldn't remember if it was an elephant or a woolly mammoth.
Well, it's an elephant.
It's an elephant?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, it's an elephant then. I mean, it doesn't really matter. Whatever it was, it's far away and small. But some people would indicate that that's what the attacker is trying to get. So, I mean, if you're not getting 100% of the people to do that, then it's like, well, probably not a good stimulus, right? It's probably not any good. On top of that, there's like a ton of other problems. Some of that is related to like subject attitudes, right? So some of you have participated, and you don't have to answer this. Some of you have participated in the study that Marissa and Laura are running, right? Some of you have done that for extra credit. I don't have any concerns about you coming in and being able to do that. You've all been in a classroom setting, you've all taken pen and paper tests, you've taken verbal, you're used to that kind of setting, right? You don't have to really go in and explain to people, okay, you need to sit down, you have to use, right? It's going to happen. If we take someone who's not used to that particular environment, who's not been in sort of a formal education situation, we try to give them that same task, it just becomes much more difficult, right? Because they're not used to that sort of setting. And so how do we do that? And then it becomes complicated. So again, that's another critique of these early, any culture study, really. Secondly, folks who are from an urban educated background are more likely to, and I'm trying to look at a number of you are in this category, wear glasses, right? When you need them. If you are in a rural, uneducated environment, the likelihood that you have corrected your vision is lower, right? And so you're going to have difficulty anytime I give you a visual task. If you're not wearing glasses, so Olivia, take off your glasses, and you're going to fail. Whatever it is, right? It doesn't matter what you know.
It's also the 60s.
Things were worse.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, these culture differences are sort of like, yeah, whatever. The other thing is this Carpenter world hypothesis, right? So basically what that means is folks who have spent most of their lives, if not all of them, in sort of an industrialized Western world, what is something that we have all seen? Right angles, right? Okay, structures, bam, there you go. If you're not in a Carpenter world, then you assume, well, maybe you're used to seeing different angles, right? Or you're not used to seeing verticals and horizontals. And so there's sort of two things that folks look at. One are geometric illusions, right? And so we'll take a look at some geometric illusions later. I gave my sort of fatherly talk too long, and we're running short on time, but we're going to get there. So there's illusions, and some people say, well, these illusions are more or less powerful in folks who are in the Carpenter world or not in the Carpenter world, and you're like, okay. And then there's something called the oblique effect. And this is saying that people are better at discriminating horizontal and vertical lines than they are lines that are at an angle, right? And so they say, oh, the oblique effect is more powerful in people who have lived in a Carpenter world because they're used to looking at these angles. Well, here's the problem. There were some folks later who went through and they looked at these studies and they were like, well, you know what? There really aren't any more vertical or horizontal lines in natural scenes than there are in man-made situations. So you're not really getting exposed to any kind of, to these at a different frequency. So that really can't be anything. Secondly, they actually took two, so one of these early studies involved some Euro-Canadians. I don't know if you know, like Euro-Canadians, right? Those are Canadians of European descent, right? And then they used some Cree Indians, right, who are like native Canadians. And the Cree did not perform as well on some of these things. And so you're thinking like, oh, there you go, that's proof, right? Carpentered world, non-carpentered world, there we go. Well, then somebody was like, hey, well, why don't we just take two urban populations and see what happens? So they looked at some folks who lived in China in urban environments and some folks who lived in, I can't remember where the other group was. I think it was
Chicago.
Was it Chicago?
Yeah, sure.
We'll go with Chicago. And they found that, in fact, the folks in China actually performed differently than the other groups. So it's like, well, if two urban groups are performing differently, then this probably is not a Carpenter world situation, right? There's something else at play. And in fact, their argument after that was there were probably some genetic differences, and that makes some sense, right? And again, we want to be careful not to say like, hey, one group's better than the other based on genetics, but anytime you end up with like a closed breeding population or a relatively closed breeding population, genetic features can get passed down, from one generation to the next, and you might see some differences in capabilities.
Can you just briefly explain the oblique effect one more time?
Yeah, so if I show you a vertical and a horizontal line, you're pretty awesome at telling me how long that is, what angle it is. If I show you a line at some angle, you're not as good.
So
That's the
basically like...
oblique lines, you have difficulty with those.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
We have difficulty seeing.
You have difficulty, so like if I gave you two oblique lines and I said, hey, which one's longer, you would have some difficulty determining which one was longer. If I said, hey, which one of those is longer, then it might be easier because they're vertical and horizontal, right? Yeah. Okay. I don't want to spend a lot of time on these illusions because we're gonna look at some illusions here in a bit. And this fun Ames window next week. Wow, Marissa, we have the best labs ever next week, don't we? If you thought the paper dragons were exciting, you guys better take a sedative before you show up to class.
Does it require scissors and taping and?
I don't think it will.
You think or you don't?
Well, there was some momentary discussion, right, of maybe it happening,
Discussion.
but I don't think we're going to be able to make it happen in time. But we might come up with something else.
So should I bring my own scissors?
Always.
Okay.
Well, you never know when you're going to have to do a haircut.
Yeah.
For a grade.
We've already talked about this. Not a big deal. Oblique effect, we already talked about that. So is there an effect on, well, for the most part, let's just go with no. Culture has no effect on perception. I think that's probably the best way to put it. The only thing that might actually be real are phonemes, right? Sounds. So babies less than a year old, they can sort of detect all phonemes from all languages, but adults and older infants really can only detect the ones that are used in their own language. Again, we have to be careful not to create a stereotype here, but I'm reminded of this time when I was in undergrad, and I was working with a master's student from Japan, and he told me I needed to make a frog in the lab, and I thought, I'm really good, but I think a frog is a little bit beyond my skill set, right? I mean, it's like, believe me, I'm very confident in what I can do, but just making a frog out of thin air is like, I'm not, Takahiro, it's not gonna happen. He's like, no, we gotta make a frog. I was like, yeah, I know, you've told me like 3 times I gotta make a frog, right? You're just gonna have to show me how to do it and we'll see what happens. He was trying to tell me he wanted me to make a flag because we were writing things, because we were like videotaping rats while they were on drugs, which was kind of interesting. And so we had to make like a flag that had like the time and the date and the experiment on there. And he was like, a flag that blows in the wind. I was like, oh, okay, I got that. But phonemes, there were some phonemes that he, as a native Japanese speaker, and he learned English much later in life, some phonemes gave him some difficulty, right? Same as if we tried to learn, if you're an English speaker and you try to learn another language and there's some different phonemes in there, you're going to really struggle with it. So, that might be the only difference, the only real difference. Oh, hey, now the stuff we can all agree on, expertise, right? Formal training. Musicians are better at timbre discrimination and auditory streaming than non-musicians. Shouldn't really be a surprise. They spend a lot of time like working on those discriminations, right? And artists show something called less of something called shape and size constancy. How many of you have ever tried to draw something and you were horrible at it? Yeah, and it was like, why did that look funny? The problem is you drew it the shape that it is and not the shape that it should look from a distance. And so here's a great example. So if you were to pick which one of these shapes most closely matches the opening of one of these mugs, you might pick something sort of like down in this area, right? Okay? No? Which one would you pick?
Are you talking about like, if I were to draw it on a piece of paper?
Yeah. If you're going to draw on...
And I want it to look what it looks like here.
Yeah.
Okay, but this circle down here is like if it's like, the cup was like this,
Exactly.
looking at me. So
Exactly.
that would be wrong. You would pick like the second one from the top.
Yeah, like up in here, right?
Yeah.
And artists are much better in general about picking this than the average population, which picks something down here. Again, through training, right? And that's why if you've ever tried to draw a cup and you're like, oh, well, the top's clearly a circle. Let me try that again. It's clearly a circle. And you're like, well, that looks stupid. Why did I draw it that way? But if you're an artist, you would draw it more like this.
Okay, so like I know exactly what you're talking about, but like what exactly is shape constancy mean? Does it just mean that
Yeah.
you're limited with?
So for those of us who aren't artists, we're going to assume shapes are constant. And if we know the top of this is a circle, then we're going to draw it as a circle or more of a circle than someone who's an artist who has some training and they realize, yes, it's a circle, but if I'm taking that and putting it on a two-dimensional surface, then I need to make it more elliptical. so that it actually looks correct when someone uses it from a distance, right? So that's exciting, right?
Yeah.
What about practice? Obviously, if you practice, you get better at identifying things. I mean, that's really all you needed there. That was an easy slide. Stuff in your brain. Musicians have a larger representation of the fingers. String musicians in particular. So string musicians, we're thinking about like folks who play the violin, for example. Their somatosensory cortex is going to have a bigger chunk of that space devoted to their fingers. Not a surprise. This taxi driver business with the larger hippocampus is related to spatial sort of things. The hippocampus is involved in creating a map of your world. So if you're a taxi driver, this is pre-GPS, you would have a larger hippocampus.
So like this stuff, like we're saying that people are better at certain things based off of what they like do, so like their expertise.
Yeah.
So like they're not like predisposed to like be better at this stuff. It's all about practice and what they do, or are like
It's probably a combination.
or are you like born to be better at like, oh, she was born to be an artist or a singer or whatever?
Obviously, if you were like born deaf or with a hearing problem, or if you were born with an abnormality in your vocal cord structure, a career in singing might not be for you.
But yet, Mozart was deaf, right?
But he didn't start out there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He didn't start out there?
No, he did not start out
Got
there.
meningitis.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he was deaf like old, not in the beginning. And so he understood, he had, some concept of those things. If you're congenitally deaf, I don't think music's for you. Not for any, I mean, it's not like, oh, deaf people can't do things. If it requires you to hear, I think it's gonna be complicated. Yeah, I don't know. I think that's a decent question. But
Because like they say, like being able to sing, it's not something they say that it's not something that you're born with. It can be like it's a learned skill. So
Well,
it can be trained to sing better.
I mean, they have voice lessons, so I would imagine that's accurate. I mean, if you think about any person who is we think about talented, in fact, they're probably quite skilled, which is different, right? There are obviously some baseline things you have to perform a task, but beyond that, I think it's probably training.
Yeah, I would think as far as the whole vocalist argument goes, I think that some people might be born with an advantage over others in certain areas. Like, some people are better equipped to be a bass, and some are better equipped to be a tenor.
Yeah, but I mean, I think, Barry White sold as many albums as Adele, so I think, I don't know if that's actually true or not. I have no idea. I'm going to assume Barry White's probably sold more just because he's had albums out longer, right? Is that probably but by like decades.
Better.
It's decades longer. And that's kind of a bass versus not a tenor because we're going to females. But I don't think females can be tenors.
Yes, they can.
Really?
Yeah, they can be, and tenors can be altos.
You're sure?
Yeah. We did it all, I was in the ensemble in high school.
Because I thought there were different lists. This is how much I know about
I've
singing.
sang tenor before, so.
I've never seen it,
Yeah.
so. And Eli's checking my Barry White versus Adele.
Oh my God.
I still,
How many we sold?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Tenor, it's not specific to the gender, it's just
Really?
the range of the notes.
Oh,
that you're
well, there you
singing,
go.
Yeah, no, I wasn't saying that
No,
gender
I know.
was.
I
I was saying that gender
Okay.
wasn't the key thing. I was saying
Right.
that some have a predisposition to be better inclined to certain things. I mean, you can take a male, I don't know the actual classification, the hierarchy.
Obviously, I don't either.
But there, you can take a male who is most equipped to sing at the highest frequencies,
Yeah,
who will suck at trying to sing bass, and vice versa.
Sure.
It has to do with vocal cords.
yeah, that's why Barry White didn't do a
Stretchiness
falsetto.
and- Yeah.
I know that.
Right, but that's why we're.
Is a
that's what
falsetto,
we're-
I was right on that.
That's right, that's
Yes.
I
correct.
used that correctly?
Yeah.
I mean, that's why we're going on with this argument that a taxi driver has a larger hippocampus therefore he can understand the world better. That's why he's not performing brain surgery.
But then there's the question, like the chicken
I'm not
and the egg
sure.
question, like.
That's actually a good question,
Become one.
especially for the hippocampus taxi driver thing.
Isn't it pre and post condition? Didn't they show in CT scans that they had smaller hippocampus before they started studying for the cavity exam and then larger ones post?
That's your chicken.
There we go. Okay.
Yeah, there you go, Josh. Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. Take the cavity exam.
Takes like 2 years to study for.
It does. It's serious business. Yeah, yeah. And then they'll just give you. They'll just let anybody put a lift sticker in their garden. You don't have to know how to get out of your driveway.
Well, you use GPS.
Yeah, that's the point. Eli, I really didn't think this would take this long. I just want to be honest with you. I thought you would just type in albums sold by Barry White, and then like a number would show up, and then albums sold by Adele, and then a number would show up.
The number didn't show up for Barry White. I had to search through his Wikipedia page.
Really?
I found it. His is in excess of 100 million
That's lifetime?
lifetime.
Okay.
But he also has like a crazy amount of like whole ass albums.
Whole ass.
Like complete albums that he like has released. At least that's what it appeared to be.
Yeah.
And Adele has quite a significant fewer amount,
Yeah.
and so she's only sold 10 million.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there you go, right?
Yeah.
That was my point. I don't remember why I said that, but there was my point. So I think it ultimately comes down to training more than it does like some natural ability. And I think, actually, I don't know, this is kind of a side story, right? But this is kind of an interesting thing. When I was listening to this, I guess this was like a year ago. There was someone, Marissa, you're going to find this interesting for some reason. I feel like you're a Willie Mays fan, and I don't know why. Yeah, I know, right? We're going to take this to Willie Mays. Who was ready for that? And so when they would describe, so we have to be careful, I think, sometimes, and I really try to like talk about like how much time and effort people put into things. When folks would talk about like Joe DiMaggio, for example, they would talk about like how much time and effort and energy and practice he put in, right? Or Ted Williams or something. And then when they talked about Willie Mays, they would talk about like his natural instincts. And I don't know if you know the difference between Willie Mays and like Joe DiMaggio or not. If anybody's like seen the picture of the two of them, and there was like some racial differences in the way that they would describe their capabilities. Like one was clearly based on like effort and willpower and the things that people were doing. The other was like, well, this person's just, they're describing it more like an animalistic term. It's really kind of interesting the way that you talk about people who are talented in their skill sets and what set of words you use for them. I think it's fascinating. I think people should think about it more often, right? Maybe they don't.
It's 6 p.m.
No, it's not.
Yes, it is.
It's 5:57.
Well, it's 5:57.
What about idiosyncratic differences? Basically, even in every group, people have like big differences, right? If I were to take two people, same age, same sex, same gender, same culture, they would probably, even if they didn't have like abnormalities in their sensory systems, they would perform differently. Why? Who knows? There are probably some neural differences, kind of what it comes down to, which is hard to do. Magic.